Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching History Makers Anna Komnena by Overly Sarcastic Productions. Now, we've been doing a lot of OSP's Byzantine history videos lately. This is one of the few that we haven't gotten to, and so I'm excited to jump into it. Now, if you guys end up enjoying this one, I'd appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon. It is linked down below, and it will give you access to exclusive reaction content. Anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's jump right into this reaction.
The Byzantine Empire has a well-deserved A+ in art class, but their written work is a little meh. Thing is,
Well, you know, we've talked a lot about Byzantine art and culture throughout OSP's videos on the Byzantine Empire. They have some very impressive stuff, also some really influential art, architecture, culture. Writing was not necessarily their strong suit. I think they are far more commonly represented through other types of art that are not written. But, you know, we have some interesting writing to turn to, though, of course, this video is about Anna Komnena, so the writing will be a main focus.
Byzantine literature reads like a modern textbook. Sure, it's informative, but the writing is drier than chalk dust, and it could stand to lose a couple hundred pages too. But there's one defiant Byzantine historian out there who did something, plot twist, cool. We've already seen narrative history on this show, as well as political analysis and epic poetry, but the Byzantine princess Anna Komnena mixed things up by writing an epic history, recounting the reign of her father, Emperor Alexios I, in the style of an epic poem.
Alright, I'm very curious to hear about her style in particular because, I mean, look, I am not a Byzantine historian of any sort. I have not read the primary sources, and so I'm curious to hear how her style was so different from the others. You know, perhaps why she wrote that way, what influence she had with, you know, the Alexiad, writing that story through the lens of an epic poem. It's an interesting way to do it, and as they're presenting it, perhaps a little less dry than some of these other histories, while still providing some very valuable information.
And if that wasn't rad enough already, Anna Komnena also happens to be the first woman historian. Hell yeah!
The first?
So, to see why Anna is such a fascinating character within Byzantine history, and to understand why her work represents everything that Byzantine literature could have and should have been, let's do some history. In many ways, Anna Komnena was a typical Byzantine princess. Born in the Purple Room of the royal palace in Constantinople, she was the eldest daughter of Emperor Alexios, and first in line to succeed him. So her early years saw lots of tutoring and imperial training, from music and courtly etiquette to theology, medicine,
and I mean, this video is about Anna Komnena, but Alexios Komnenos, I think, one of the more fascinating Byzantine emperors. He is a very impressive guy, and a very interesting one. I always think these leaders who ruled during times when their empires were down, not doing so well, and managed to shore up the defenses, bring their empires back from the brinks of collapse, these, to me, are sort of particularly interesting rulers, so he's interesting in his own right, frankly.
And a little smidge of philosophy. But aside from studying and entertaining the occasional dignitary, the average young Byzantine royal didn't really do all that much. However, Anna was not a typical Byzantine princess, as she was an extraordinary student with a remarkable eye for literature. She regularly hounded her tutors for treatises on astronomy, military strategy, history, rhetoric, and mathematics.
And I also think, now, once again, I'm not a Byzantine historian, so I'm absolutely not the person to turn to about this, but to my understanding, at this point, you know, we think of the sort of era of classical literature. Ancient Greece, ancient Rome, a lot of these famous classics. And of course, we have many of them today. Many of them haven't survived today. Not to mention that, of course, access in the medieval world to these texts was a lot more difficult. Now, this is someone who has the utmost privilege. If anyone can access these books, then someone like she can. But maybe she still cannot under those circumstances, and it is my understanding that some of these ancient texts were very hard to come by during this time period. Perhaps you couldn't find them at all. Maybe they were only circulating around in Latin Europe. Maybe they were circulating around the Arab world. And so to have such a fierce interest in literature was, I believe, somewhat rare for the era, and probably could have been a challenging interest to have, at least if you wanted to consume as many of these books as you could.
Plus any loose Aristotle within a 100-mile radius. But for all the schooling her parents gave her, and believe me, it was probably the best curriculum either side of 500 years, there was still one more thing she wanted to learn about. Since the Byzantine Empire was pretty firmly Christian, classical literature was taboo to read on account of all of the...
Right, and so that's another aspect. Not only was access to these works of classical literature difficult, just because of the difficulty of preservation and the amount of time that had passed, but also due to Christianity, right? The Byzantine Empire was a very strongly Orthodox Christian empire, and while they hadn't completely left classical education and thought behind, it was a little more, some of it in particular, a little more taboo, seen as this sort of pagan style of literature, pagan style of thought, so that would also have made access more difficult. Not impossible, no, but probably more difficult.
The paganism. Scholars had called it dangerous for men and especially insidious for women.
Right.
Whatever that is supposed to mean. But as far as Anna was...
Well, you know what it means, right? It's this sort of paternalistic attitude towards everybody, but especially towards women. Well, we can't trust them to read this. Who knows what's going to happen, right? Tied up with the sort of religious part of it, so yeah, we know what they mean.
Concerned those were wimpy excuses for dumb idiot quitters, so she snuck copies of Homer's epics out of the Imperial Library and read them in secret. You go, Anna. Even among her, let's say, less than female empowering contemporaries, she was recognized as devoted to philosophy, the queen of all sciences, and educated in every field.
Wow.
That's high praise. But
yeah.
Even with the best library in the world on tap, Anna made like a Disney princess and started looking for ways to get out of the palace. So her father built a 10,000-bed hospital and orphanage specifically so that Anna could administer it. There she also wrote entire medical treatises, likely taught some of the doctors of the hospital, and possibly served as a physician herself. We do know that Anna was her father's primary caretaker.
And that's a really interesting little factoid. Byzantine medicine was extremely well regarded, and their preservation of an innovation on ancient techniques was essential to the later development of Islamic and Renaissance medicine. That's really fascinating. And it makes you think that oftentimes we think of history as this sort of progression forward. Everything keeps moving forward, keeps getting better, but history is not linear, right? You have ups and downs, and it moves all over the place. And so this reminds you that some of these medical techniques that maybe were more advanced than you may expect from the medieval world, they were only preserved in certain places, and they get passed along from person to person, from state to state, and only get preserved in specific texts with specific people until they get more widely spread much later on. It's just a good reminder that, especially when we talk about pre-modern history, information is difficult to preserve, and a lot of information isn't preserved and is lost throughout history, and the information that is preserved that we have today often has a very tenuous path to make it to us in the modern world.
During the last years of his reign, so she clearly got the practice somewhere. Alright, so it's no secret that Anna Komnena was a genius polymath, casual, no sweat, but the other reason she's a unique princess is because her father was a unique emperor.
Yeah.
Alexios came to power at a bad time, to put it
Yeah,
mildly.
you could say
the
that.
The Byzantines had lost a casual half of their empire a decade earlier, and the ensuing civil wars were obvious.
I mean, the Byzantine Empire was already in big-time decline. They'd already lost a lot of territory, but, as they're pointing out, in a very short span of time, the empire was really starting to properly crumble.
Less than fun. In the mid-1070s, Alexios was a general in the Byzantine army, playing whack-a-traitor against an array of rebelling governors and mercenaries in western Greece. Meanwhile, in Constantinople, Alexios' mother, Anna de Lassini, was playing politics to convince the aristocrats that Alexios was the cataphract's pajamas and should totally be the next emperor. With a silver tongue and an improbable amount of nat 20s on her persuasion checks, she bought Alexios the time and resources he needed to swoop right onto the imperial throne.
Damn, okay. Well, it looks like I was going to say she had the same talents as him, but it's better to say that he had the same talents as his mother. Perhaps that's where he got it from, because Alexios was known for being very charming and also having that silver tongue. A brilliant diplomat, talker, was able to wriggle his way out of any situation, by speaking well enough, and of course with a well-placed and often very large bribe.
From there, Alexios began arguably the hardest of hard carries in Byzantine history, with enemies clawing at every border.
I mean, we have a couple of examples of hard carries in Byzantine history. You can think of, say, Heraclius bringing the empire back from the brink against the Sassanids. Of course, he would then later struggle against the Caliphate, but that's an impressive hard carry. we have a couple of these examples, but Alexios Komnenos, he is a fantastic example of hard carrying the empire through an extremely difficult time and truly pulling it back from the brink.
Half of the empire gone, potential usurpers behind every corner, and a treasury collecting more cobwebs than coins, Alexios' restoration of Byzantine stability and prosperity over his 37-year reign was borderline miraculous.
Yeah.
Under Alexios, the empire campaigns tirelessly against invading Normans, Turks, and Pechenegs. So far,
And it really is, the Byzantine Empire had been in a long terminal decline, right? I think when we get to this time period, the last couple hundred years of Byzantine history, this is when it really enters the decline, and it's obvious, and nothing's inevitable, but in some ways it really seems to become unstoppable. And so I think Alexios, he is truly one of those characters who actually sort of pushes history back. The collapse of the empire is looming in the future. It will happen. And like they said, miraculously, Alexios actually manages to prevent it. It's not like, I pulled the empire back and now everything is all great. No, that is not the situation we're dealing with. Everything is still very bad. Alexios somehow manages to preserve the life of an empire that, if you fast forward a couple hundred years, will still fall. I mean, fast forward only about 200 years and Constantinople will be sacked and the empire will once again be brought to its knees. So that, for me, makes it even more impressive what Alexios Komnenos did. He is fighting against the forces of history.
From a quiet upbringing in a chilled-out Constantinople, Anna's early years were set against a backdrop of constant political chaos, though during her father's reign she would prove extremely attentive to the imperial goings-on. But despite all the wars and chaos, the most significant challenge to Anna's ambitions would come from her younger brother. In 1092, John Komnenos was designated by Alexios as the imperial heir, bumping Anna right out of the succession order. This, understandably, made Anna feel quite cheated out of her imperial birthright.
Yeah.
So during Alexios' final years, Anna and her mom Irene tried to persuade him not to hand John the crown, but Alexios wouldn't budge. Supposedly, Anna was planning to assassinate John and throw a coup, but the plan failed because her mother and her husband Nicephorus were too skittish to go along. Which doesn't even make sense to me. You're a Byzantine royal. If you don't have the spine for a little coup d'etat, what are you even doing here? Ugh. Anyway, Anna was eventually found out and swiftly banished from the palace by John. When Anna's husband died 2
Yeah, and okay, so our sources for Anna's palace exile are sparse. She barely mentions it. We really don't know what happened. Also, this idea that she was going to perform a coup is one of those things that absolutely could have been true, and she got found out, and she was exiled. It could have not been true. I mean, we don't know it was true. It could have been made up, and someone, John probably, put it out there to get her exiled. Or maybe there were whispers, there was sort of a vague plan, and a may or may not have been involved, and this so-called plot got discovered, and she still got exiled. With the sources we have, and honestly, even at the time, with that sort of palace intrigue, probably would have been unclear to what extent this was a real plot being put into motion. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, maybe somewhere in between, but it's a good way, if you have an enemy, to get them out of there, to either discover some sort of plot, maybe invent some sort of plot, and then blame it on them.
years later, John confined her to the Kekaridomeni monastery in Constantinople. There, Anna spent the last 35 years of her life with her library and her mind, dutifully composing what would become the masterwork of her whole empire, the Alexiad.
Yes, and this is where we get the Alexiad. And I gotta wonder, I am not up on Byzantine historiography, but one of my assumptions might be that the reason we have a lot of information, say, about this era, or about Alexios Komnenos, is because of this work by his daughter. Maybe, maybe not true. Those who know more, you can comment down below, or maybe we will find out in this video.
This book is so impressive because it's not only a detailed account of Alexios' reign, which is already one of the most complex periods in Byzantine history,
Right.
but it's also an entire epic poem. She wrote beautifully in the Attic dialect of ancient Greek, and never misses an opportunity to slip in a casual 1500-year-old reference to someone like Sophocles or Thucydides. As an example, just listen to the first paragraph of the prologue, where she describes the extremely simple concept of people forget things when time passes.
Yes!
Time, which flies irresistibly and perpetually, sweeps up and carries away with it everything that has seen the light of day and plunges it into utter darkness. whether deeds of no significance or those that are mighty and worthy of commemoration. Then there's a quick Sophocles quote. Nevertheless, the science of history is a great bulwark against the stream of time. In a way, it checks this irresistible flood. It holds in a tight grasp whatever it can seize floating on the surface, and will not allow it to slip away into the depths of oblivion.
Wow. Okay, so she put far more beautifully the point that I was making earlier about how easy it is to lose information and knowledge over time, how tenuous that can be. That was phrased so fantastically here. Also, the perspective on history. I'm not going to say it's necessarily a modern perspective on history, because, people throughout history, some people have believed the importance of the profession, but what I will say is that, this is something that we more generally believe today about the importance of history and what it can do for us, and so it's nice to see it highlighted here. I always like an appreciation of the discipline, right? And of course, it seems like she was a great historian herself. And yeah, I love the way she phrased this. And also, the inclusion of a far more classical quote sort of made me think, and something I wanted to add to my earlier point about how easy it is to lose information over time. Texts are very easy to lose, physical texts, especially over the span of 1,000 or thousands of years. In many cases, the only writing we have surviving from ancient authors is something that is written down in another text about them, or some of their quotes, or a reference to them, and then we have to look at that to sort of piece together what they had written, or what we know about them. So once again, that sort of tenuous connection over time that Anna Komnena just put so well right there.
Then she gives her literary resume, in which she quantifies reading all of Aristotle and Plato as some acquaintance with literature. So, safe to say, the princess
better than me, I'll tell you that.
knew her way around a quill and paper. At the risk of turning this video into a Komnena quote fest, and believe me, I could, I'm gonna pivot
It seems like there's a lot of, honestly, like I said, I've not read many Byzantine primary sources, but this video is kind of making me want to read the Alexiad.
Off the epic writing style, but rest assured that all of the history in this book reads like silk. The other of Anna's defining characteristics...
Let's be honest, many historians even today cannot accomplish that. Hey, not naming any names, and, it's very difficult to write compelling history, but she achieved something that is still very challenging.
This is her perspective. It's as far from a dry, detached look at history as can be.
I love
because
that.
She was there when a lot of the stuff was going down. Anna was a teenager during the First Crusade. She describes meeting with the kings of Europe. She describes how she was not particularly impressed. And when Anna isn't working...
That's great, honestly, and it's an interesting question, right? How detached should you actually be? What I'll say is that to have someone with that first-hand experience is excellent. Now, of course, when someone has that first-hand experience, and they have a background like that, or really anybody, we have to be cognizant of the sort of bias that they might have. Sure, but that's applicable to everybody. No matter how detached someone pretends to be, everyone's got a bias. So when you recognize that bias, that's the better way to go about it. You can still give your opinion, and in fact, history is better when people have opinions to give. That's sort of the point of this whole thing, is we analyze our sources, you synthesize that, and you make an argument. If you're not making any arguments, you're not really saying anything new. You just have to be sure that your arguments are informed, and you let us all know what biases you have, right? Because obviously that can shape your perspective, and personal experience can as well, but that's a really great thing to have, and that's a great thing to be recorded, that sort of personal experience from someone in such an important position.
From her own experience in the royal court, she had access to prior historical works, official reports, treaties and archived documents, eyewitness accounts from battles, recorded speeches, plus the emperor's own recollection.
Yeah, you can think of how hard it is to get access to some primary sources today. Historians have to go digging through archives. If they can even get access to the archives they need, imagine how difficult it was at this point. Even for Anna, I'm sure it was pretty difficult to get a hold of some of these sources that she might have needed, but she's just about one of the few people who could have done it at this time. When we talk about, who could have written this sort of history at this level during this era of, this type of Byzantine history, the pool of applicants is pretty small.
Very few Byzantine historians could boast a bibliography
Yeah.
that stacked.
Yeah.
Alright, so now let's look at what Anna actually recounts in her Alexiad. The work is split into 15 books plus a preface. 1 through 3 describe Alexios during the revolts and civil wars, from his time as a general up through his ascension to the throne. After his coronation, books 4 through 9 are damage control, as Alexios wages war against the invading Normans to the west, Pechenegs to the north, and Seljuk Turks to the east. But then, just as things are starting to calm down, the pious armies of Europe arrive to save the day. By which, I mean the bandit hordes take 2 steps into an empire that's shinier than theirs and immediately start stealing things. As you might have guessed, books 10 and 11 are about the Crusades.
Yeah, so the Empire is surrounded on every side by enemies, and Alexios has to defend against them. Impressive enough already, and then we get to the First Crusade. Now, Alexios had reached out to the Western Latin Christians for help. The help they gave to him was not exactly what he expected. They decided to gather together this holy crusade and march through his territory. Now, in the end, the First Crusade was more beneficial for the Byzantines, especially if you compare it to some of the other crusades. Think of the future, 1204. Anyway, but Alexios knew the risk that it presented. He knew how vulnerable he was to these Latin Christian armies marching through his land, and he knew he had to be very careful. He had to deal with them very cautiously. He had to use that silver tongue and his ability to hand out bribes to get these crusaders through his territory without them completely destroying it from the inside out.
After dodging that 2-ton wrecking ball, books 12 through 14 describe even more conflicts with the Normans and assorted other enemies, and finally, book 15 wraps the tale with a sorrowful account of Alexios' death and Anna's grief. Anna's monumental devotion to her father, for all that tragic pathos, is also where the Alexiad runs into trouble. On a purely factual level, Anna misplaces some dates and whiffs a battle here and there, but Anna's most consistently criticized for her nearly spotless praise of her father.
Right, and this is why I say we need to recognize the bias that historians or writers generally come at these topics with. And so I like that you come at a topic with an opinion, but we need to understand how your opinion can be shaped by your bias, your own personal experience. Of course, being the daughter of the man you were writing about is a pretty massive bias, so it's something we really have to take into account.
And since the Alexiad leans more towards the first portion of Alexios' reign, we're left wondering if maybe the second half wasn't as great of a time. And those are valid points. It's important to recognize source bias in every historical document, but it's also good to understand what we can.
Yeah, iffy chronology, it's more of a sort of factual error. More sort of objective. Clear bias for Alexios, of course, that's what we're just talking about. Pervasive disgust towards crusaders, that makes a lot of sense. I kind of get it. No attempt at impersonal perspective. This is like a pro and a con. I mean, there is something to be said about her speaking from her perspective and giving her experiences. There is also something to be said for at least trying to come at things from an impersonal perspective. So, there's a balancing act to be done there. But what I will say is that this is a work of history, right? And so we can read it as that. But given that it is a primary source from the era, we can also use it to sort of examine some of the perspectives of the era. Or some of these are just the perspectives of Anna herself, her bias for her father. Maybe not everybody would have felt that way, but her perspective about the Western Christians and the Crusaders and the Crusades, this is something that we might be able to generalize a little bit more, or at least generalize to a specific group. And so some of these things we can look at and go, okay, this actually tells us a bit about the Byzantines during this time, right?
Gained by a fundamentally biased account. Anna gives us a vivid and rare picture of the Byzantine world from a royal...
So pros, best source in Alexios, absolutely. Only Byzantine view of Crusades, and sort of that's what I was talking about. It gives us a Byzantine perspective on the whole thing. Not that you can necessarily generalize that out to everybody, but you can do a little bit. And then, like I was talking about, there's a balancing act, so one of the cons is no attempt at impersonal perspective. But then one of the pros is personal and direct. It's a pro and a con.
perspective, and she helps us read her work critically because she doesn't mince words. She thought her dad was the coolest dude, and she thought that the Europeans were a bunch of gold-hungry morons. And let's be honest here, her representative sample size was crusaders. Of course she thought the Byzantines were better in literally every way. Now, for some scholars, this all raises the question of whether the Alexiad is more a piece of literature or more of a history. But I'd say that that balance is exactly what makes Anna's work so special.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I will say, we have a very firm distinction between the two. At times, the distinction between literature and history was very blurry or non-existent. Now, we can point to historians throughout history who had more of an eye for source checking and actual factual history. They lean more towards a sort of modern view on history, but there are a lot of historians who lean somewhere in between or more towards the literature side of things. Now, the claim OSP is making here is that Anna was sort of somewhere in the middle. She had that aspect of the literary flourish, but also was doing some good history, right? I haven't read it, and I'm not an expert, so I can't really judge that for myself. Some historians absolutely leaned more towards the literary side of things, and they didn't really see much of a distinction between the two, so this is something where the way that we would view it is often not the way that other people have viewed the topic.
Despite the vast literary catalog of medieval and classical Greece all available on tap, Byzantine authors weren't being particularly inventive with any of it.
Yeah, I mean, there are some works of Byzantine writing that we still know today. There are some important works of history. But what I will say, and I am not that familiar with Byzantine writing, is that when we think about some of this classic literature, impressive literature throughout history, we don't usually turn to the Byzantine Empire. We might think of an earlier era, which is what they're pointing out here, some of these earlier classical authors. Or at least I'll speak for myself, I don't necessarily think of the Byzantine Empire as an overly literary culture.
So in an empire where history was plain and literature was long-winded, Anna flipped the script by taking the best of both, combining the personal significance of history and the elegant stylings of epic poetry into something completely new but still distinctly Byzantine. Anna's account of Alexios evokes the image of a classical epic hero while seamlessly pulling tropes from Greek hagiography to paint Alexios as a pious and saintly.
Honestly, when we talk about Byzantine literary culture, a big part of that is hagiography. I don't know how to pronounce it, sorry. And then pointing it out here, a genre of biography for saints. I have not thought about hagiography in a while. But that was, when we talk about Byzantine writing that might have been popular within the empire, prevalent at the time, hagiography is one of the first genres we might turn to, which makes sense when we're talking about such a religious Christian empire, right?
Emperor. The Alexiad is so damn cool because it builds on so many wildly diverse aspects of Greek writing across the entire 2,000-year span. So that's what I mean when I say that this is what Byzantine literature could have and should have been. But all's well, it's gonna be okay. As we've seen before and we'll see again, this is hardly the most tragic screw-up in Byzantine history. That honor would go to Byzantine history. But
yeah, and look, I'm not gonna make any sort of really firm judgments on Byzantine literary culture. I can just tell you what I know. OSP, or Blue, I think it is, right? I'm not really that familiar with the characters on the channel. I think it's Blue. Seems to have a stronger opinion on the topic, but also I think knows a lot more on the topic. But yeah, if we want to talk about Byzantine mistakes, there are a lot bigger mistakes than not writing enough great literature.
But even if the Alexiad is a lone triumph in a sea of medieval meh, Anna undeniably earned her place alongside Greece's greatest writers. And not to hammer the point too finely, but Greek literature is a sausage fest, so Anna Komnena is clearly an odd one out here. Celebrating her as the first woman historian, it's important to recognize—
Is she really the first woman historian? I mean, I can't disprove that. I can't think of earlier women historians, but so I mean they might be right. I would love to hear from some of you down below if you have other thoughts on this, or if this is true, she really is our first known woman historian.
How hard she worked to get her
it seems like a big claim to make, so I'm instantly skeptical, but maybe is true.
As well as why she only wrote the Alexiad because she got screwed out of her throne. It's easy to lessen her story to just princess wanted to be empress, failed, got mad, sulked, and then wrote a history about it. And historians like Edward Gibbon have famously done exactly that. And in case the point wasn't quite clear, he also made sure to trash her as jealous, manic, and full of the...
Yeah, well, Gibbon's work was very influential at the time, and has been very influential since, but that does not mean that it was accurate. Yeah, it has been very influential in sort of modern Western history, but a lot of things that have been influential over the last couple hundred years have not aged particularly well, right? We have ideally sort of developed in our history since then, even if it was influenced by works such as Gibbon's, absolutely.
Female vanity. That's a quote. Even if we're not being a colossal knobhead about it, however, Anna's work does have distinctly feminine characteristics, which she openly acknowledges. Anna's perspective on history is much more personal and emotive than the straight-laced works of her all-male peers. Their man histories for macho men were expected to be stoic and aloof because that was the manly thing to do.
Yeah, and I think, this is honestly something that we still think about today. Now, and of course, there's a big distinction today between, like academic history and pop history. But if we're talking, say, about academic history, you are expected to be sort of detached, academic, aloof. But you're also expected to present an argument, your own opinion, backed up by evidence, of course. And there is absolutely a place for personal narratives and personal experiences. I mean, I think a really big place. There's sort of some debate over this, and there can be a debate about the style. Is there a place for a more personal style in academic literature? You'll get a lot of different opinions, but I do think it's a balancing act that we're still dealing with right now.
So Anna actively leaned into certain gender conventions in order to break out of restrictive authorial conventions. And so, 2 millennia after Homer and some 1500 years post-Herodotus, Greece got its first epic poet historian in Anna Komnena. Step up your game, boys. Thank you all so much for watching, and...
That was a great video! That was really interesting, Anna Komnena, a character I did not know too much about, aside from the big things, of course. Really interesting video. We ended up talking a lot more about history than I would have expected, though maybe the title History Maker should have clued me in on that. But yeah, I thought this was a really interesting episode. If you guys enjoyed this one, please leave a like, subscribe, and I'd be interested to hear your comments down below. I always like to hear your perspectives, whether they be similar or different to mine, right? Yeah, so I hope you guys enjoyed this one. And I hope you're all having a good day today. I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.